Chapter 4. Beatrice. Without having seen my friend again, at the end of the vacation I traveled to State Dash. Both my parents came along with all possible care and trusted me to the protection of a boys' boarding house run by a teacher at the secondary school. They would have frozen with horror had they known what kind of life they were now letting me drift into. The question was still whether with time I could become a good son and useful citizen, or whether my nature urged me onto other paths. My latest attempt at happiness within the shadow of my father's house and spirit had lasted a long time, had occasionally been almost successful, and yet had completely failed at the end. The strange happiness and solitude had first come to feel during the vacation after my confirmation. How familiar I was to become with it later on, that emptiness, that rarefied atmosphere, didn't pass away so quickly. Saying goodbye to my home came oddly easily to me. I was actually ashamed at not being gloomier. My sisters cried for no particular reason, but I couldn't. I was surprised at myself. I had always been an affectionate child and basically a rather good child. Now I was completely transformed. I acted totally indifferent to the world outside and was for days on end was only concerned with listening to myself, with hearing the streams, the forbidden dark streams that resounded within me beneath the surface. I had grown taller very quickly, all within the last half year, and it was a gangly, skinny, half-baked youth who looked out onto the world. Boyish charm had vanished from me altogether. I myself felt that no one could love me as I was, and I didn't like myself one whit. I often missed Maximian badly, but not infrequently I hated him too and blamed him for the impoverishment of my life, which I took upon myself like a loathsome disease. In our schoolboys' boarding house, I was at first neither liked nor accepted and respected. First, I was teased, then, they left me alone and considered me to be a hypocrite and an unpleasant outsider. I enjoyed the role and even exaggerated it, becoming a loner out of resentment. On the outside, my solitude constantly resembled the most manly contempt for the world, whereas in secret I was often subject to debilitating attacks of melancholy and despair. At school, I was able to draw upon knowledge I had accumulated back home. My class was behindhand compared to my old one, and I got used to regarding the boys of my age somewhat contemptuously as children. Things continued that way for a year and more. Even my first trips during home added no new note. I was glad to leave again. It was the beginning at the November. I had grown accustomed to taking short walks for thinking things over, no matter what the weather was. On these walks, I often enjoyed a sort of rapture, a rapture filled with melancholy and with contempt for the world and for myself. And so I was sauntering one evening in the damp, misty twilight through the outskirts of town. The broad, tree lined avenue of a public park was completely deserted and invited me to walk there. The path was heaped high with fallen leaves, into which I burrowed my toes with an obscure desire. There was a damp, bitter smell. The trees in the distance emerged from the mist as tall and shadowy as ghosts. At the end of the avenue, I halted undecidedly, stared at the black foliage, and lustily inhaled the damp aroma of decay and dying, which something in me responded to and welcomed. How insipid life tasted! From a side path, a person in a fluttering collar approached. I was about to walk away when he called me. "Hello, Sinclair." He came up to me. It was Alphonse Beck, the oldest boy in our boarding house. I was always glad to see him and had nothing against him except that he was always sarcastic and patronizing to me, as he was to all boys younger than himself. He was said to be strong as a bear and to have the master of a boarding house under his thumb, and he was the hero of many a tale in our secondary school gossip. "What are you doing here?" he called sociably in the tone the older boys affected when they occasionally condescended to address one of us. "Yes, I bet you are writing poetry." "Never entered my mind." I contradicted him gruffly. He walked, laughed alongside me, and chatted in a way I was no longer used to. "You don't have to be afraid that I might not understand you, Sinclair. I know a person is affected when he walks around in the mist like this in the evening, with thoughts of autumn. Then he is inclined to write poetry. I know. About dying nature, naturally, and about lost youth, which resembles it. Take Heinrich Heine. I'm not that sentimental," I said in my defense. "Well, let that go. But I think that in this weather it's a good idea to seek out a quiet place where you can get a glass of wine or something. Do you want to join me? I happen to be all alone. Or would you rather not? I don't want to be your tempter, my friend, in case you want to be a model boy." Soon afterward, we were sitting in a little suburban tavern, drinking a wine of dubious quality and clinking our thick glasses together. At first, I didn't like it much, but at any rate, it was something new. But soon, being unused to wine, I became very talkative. It was as if a window had opened inside me, letting the world shine in. How terribly long it had been since I gotten anything off my chest. I began rambling on eventually, and in the thick of it, I trotted out the story of Cain and Abel. Beck listened to me with pleasure. At last, someone I could give something to. He tapped me on the shoulder. He called me a hell of a guy, and my heart was swelling with bliss at being able to pour out lavishly words and communications which I had needed to speak but which had been tamped up. Bliss at being accepted as a companion and holding my own to some extent with an older youth. When he called me a clever dog, the phrase coursed through me like sweet, strong wine. The world was glowing in new colors. Ideas flowed into my mind from 100 bubbling springs. The flame of intellect blazed up in me. We talked about our teachers and schoolmates, and I thought we were getting on splendidly. We talked about the Greeks and pagan culture, and Beck tried hard to make me own up to erotic adventures. There I was unable to participate. I had no experiences, nothing that I could be told. What I had felt, devised, or imagined in my mind was burning inside me, to be sure, but even the wine hadn't set it free to be discussed. Beck knew much more about girls, and I listened to those tales passionately. I learned incredible things on that occasion. Things I never thought possible entered my dull existence and seemed self evident. Alphonse Beck, who was perhaps 18, had already gathered knowledge. Among other things, he had learned that the trouble with girls was that they wanted nothing but flattery and attentions, which was perfectly fine, but not the essential thing. Greater success could be expected with grown women. Women were much cleverer. For example, Mrs. Jaglach, who owned a store with notebooks and pencils, was a woman you could talk to, and the things that had taken place behind her counter couldn't be printed. I sat there under a deep spell, stupefied. To be sure, I wouldn't exactly have been able to love Mrs. Jaglet, but anyway, it was amazing. Opportunities seemed to be available, at least for the older boys, that I had never dreamed of. Yes, there was a false note in this, and it all tasted cheaper and more common than love ought to taste, in my opinion. But anyway, it was reality, it was life and adventure. Someone was sitting next to me who had experienced it to whom it seemed self evident. Our conversation had lowered its tone somewhat. It had lost some quality, and I no longer the self clever guy. Now I was just a boy listening to a man. But even so, compared with what my life had been for months and months, this was priceless. This was heavenly. Besides, as I only now gradually begin to feel, it was forbidden, strictly forbidden, from sitting in a tavern to our current topic of conversation. At any rate, I found it in a taste of intellect, a taste of revolution. I remember that night extremely distinctly. When the two of us started walking home in the chilly, damp late night, passing the dimly burning gas street lamps, I was drunk for the first time. It wasn't pleasant. It was extremely distressing, and yet even that has something to it, an attraction, a sweetness. It was rebellion and orgy. It was life and intellect. Beck took charge of me valiantly, though he cursed me bitterly as a raw novice, and half carrying me, he brought me home, where he managed to sneak me and himself through an open vestibule window. But when I was sober, waking up from a very brief dead sleep, an unreasoning sorrow overcame me. I sat up in bed, still wearing my daytime shirt. My clothes and shoes were scattered on the floor and smelled of tobacco and vomit. And between headache, nausea, and a wild thirst, an image arose in my mind that I hadn't faced up to for a long time. I saw my hometown and my parents' house, my father and mother, sisters, and the garden. I saw my quiet, homey bedroom. I saw my school and market square. I saw Demian and our confirmation lessons, and all of that was bright. It was all surrounded by radiance. It was all wonderful, divine, and pure, and all of that, I knew it now, had belonged to me and had been waiting for me only yesterday, only hours ago, and now, just now, at that moment, it had sunk out of sight and was accursed. It no longer belonged to me. It cast me out. It looked on me with disgust. All the love and warmth my parents had shown me since the remotest, most golden gardens of my childhood. Every kiss from my mother, every Christmas, every pious, bright Sunday morning at home, every flower in the garden, it was all ravaged. I had trampled on it all. Its bailiffs had come at that moment, tied my hands, and led me to the gallows as an outcast and a chaflier of the temple. I would have agreed to it. I would have gone gladly. I would have considered it proper and right. Then, then, was how I looked on the inside. I who went around despising the world. I who was proud in mind and shared some ideas with Demian. That's how I looked. An outcast, a dirty pig, drunk and filthy, disgusting and common, a dissolute beast, caught unawares by my horrible impulses. That's how I looked. I who came from those gardens where everything was purity, radiance, and loving tenderness. I who had loved music by Bach and beautiful poems. It was with disgust and rage that I still heard my own laughter, a drunken, uncontrolled laughter that broke out in fists and sounded stupid. That's who I was. But despite everything, it was almost a pleasure to suffer those torments. I had crawled through life blindly and dully for so long. My heart had kept silent and had sat impoverished in a corner for so long that even these self accusations, this horror, this whole ghastly emotion in my soul was welcome. After all, it was an emotion. Flames were still rising. It showed that my heart was still alive. in a confused way. In the midst of my misery, I felt something like liberation and springtime. Meanwhile, viewed from the outside, things were going decidedly downhill for me. My first binge was soon no longer the only one. At our school, there was a lot of tavern going and tomfoolery. I was one of the very youngest among those who joined in, and soon I was no longer a youngster who was merely tolerated, but a leader and chief, a notorious, reckless tavern goer. Once again I belonged wholly to the dark world, to the devil, and in that world I counted as a great guy. But as I did so, I felt terrible. My life drifted by in a self destructive orgy, and while I was looked on by my schoolmates as a leader and a hell of a guy, I jammed pluckily and witty fellow. Deep inside me, my anxiety ridden soul was shaking with alarm. I still recall that tears once came to my eyes when I stepped out of a tavern one Sunday morning and saw children playing in the street, bright and happy, with hair just combed in their Sunday best. And while I was still sitting among pools of beer at dirty tables in cheap taverns, entertaining and often frightening my friends with unusually cynical remarks. Deep in my heart, I revolved everything I was mocking, and in my mind, I was weeping on my knees before my soul, my past, my mother, and God. If I never was at one with my companions, if remained solitary in their company and was thus able to suffer this way, there was a good reason for it. I was a saloon goer and cynic to suit the most vulgar people. I displayed wit and courage in what I thought and said about our teachers, schools, parents, church. I even tolerated dirty jokes and occasionally dared to tell some of my own. But I was never alone when my buddies visited girls. I was alone and filled with ardent longing for love, hopeless longing, while to judge by what I said, I would have to have been a veteran playboy. No one was more vulnerable or shy than I was. And when I occasionally saw young middle class girls walking by me, pretty and clean, bright and graceful, they were wonderful, pure. I dream in my eyes a thousand times too good and pure for me. For a time, I couldn't even go back to Mrs. Jaglett's stationery store because I blushed whenever I saw and thought about what Alphonse Beck had told me about her. The more I felt constantly alone and different, even in my new circle of friends, the more unable I was to break away. I really longer recalled whether drinking and boasting ever actually gave me pleasures beside, and never got so used to alcohol that I didn't suffer painful consciences every time I drank. It was all like a compulsion. I did what I had to because otherwise I simply had no idea what to do with myself. I was afraid of being alone for long periods. I stood in fear of the numerous tender, shy, warm impulses towards which I constantly felt responsive. I stood in fear of the tender thoughts of love that came to me so frequently. One thing I missed above all, a friend. There were two or three fellow students whose company I enjoyed a lot, but they were among the well behaved, and for some time my vices had been no secret to anyone. They avoided me. They all regarded me as a desperate gambler who was losing his footing. The teachers knew a lot about me. I had been severely punished several times. My definitive expulsion was expected. I myself knew it. Besides, by that time I had long ceased to be a good student, but painfully squeezed and cheated my way through with a feeling that things couldn't go on that way very long. There were many ways in which the God can make us lonely and lead us to ourselves. He took that path with me in those days. It was like a bad dream. I see myself spellbound in a dream, restless and in torment, crawling along past slimy fields, broken beer glasses, and nights of cynical conversation and ugly, unclean path. There are dreams in which you are on the way to meet a princess but get bogged down in puddles of excrement and back alleys reeking with garbage. That's how it was with me. It was my lot, in this indelicate way, to grow lonely and to erect between me and my childhood a locked door to Eden with mercilessly flaming guardians. It was a beginning, an awakening of homesickness for myself. I still got frightened and felt twinges when my father, alarmed by letters from the teacher who ran my boarding house, first appeared in S dash, unexpectedly walked up to me when, toward the end of that winter, he came the second time. I was already handsed, hardened, and indifferent. I let him scold me, let him plead with me, let him remind me of my mother. Finally, he got very worked up and said, if I didn't change my ways, he would let me be kicked out of school in disgrace and would put me in a reform school. Well, let him. When he departed that time, I felt sorry for him. But he hadn't accomplished a thing. He hadn't been able to reach me anymore, and for a while I felt that it served him right. I didn't care what would become of me. In my peculiar and unlovely way, I was at war with the world when I sat in taverns and bragged. It was my form of protest. By doing so, I was ruining myself, and at times my prospects were more or less as follows. If the world couldn't use people like me, if it had no better place or higher goals for them, then people like me just went to wreck and ruin. Let the world suffer the consequences. Christmas vacation that year was most enjoyable. My mother got scared when she saw me again. I had grown even taller, and my thin face looked grey and ravaged, with limp features and red rimmed eyes. The first hint of a mustache and the eyeglasses I had recently started to wear made me even more unfamiliar to her. My sisters hung back and giggled. Everything was unpleasant. Unpleasant and bitter the conversation with my father in his study. Unpleasant the greeting from the handful of relatives. Unpleasant above all, Christmas Eve. All my life that had been the great day in our house, the evening of festivity and love, of gratitude, of renewing the bond between my parents and myself. This time everything was merely oppressive and embarrassing. As usual, my father read aloud from the Gospel the passage about the shepherds in their fields, watching their flocks by night. As usual, my sister stood radiantly in front of their table of presents. But my father's voice sounded unhappy, and his face looked old and gaunt, and my mother was sad, and to me everything was equally painful and unwanted. Good gifts and good wishes, gospel and lighted tree. The gingerbread sweet smell gave off dense clouds of sweeter memories. The Christmas tree was aromatic and told of things that no longer existed. I longed for the end of the evening and the vacation. Things continued that way all winter. Only shortly before I had received a drastic warning from the Council of Teachers and had been threatened with expulsion. It wouldn't last much longer. Well, what did I care? I had a special grudge against Max Demian. I hadn't seen him again in all that time. At the beginning of my school days in State Dash, I had written him twice, but never got an answer. For that reason, I hadn't visited him during my vacation either. In the same park where I had run across elephants back in the fall, it happened at the beginning of spring, just when the hawthorn hedges were beginning to get green, that a girl caught my attention. I had gone out for a walk alone, filled with repellent thoughts and worries because my health had gotten bad, and in addition, I was constantly in financial difficulties. I owed some to schoolmates. I had to invent the urgent need to purchase supplies in order to get more money from home, and I had allowed bills for cigars and such to pile up in several stores. Not that these worries went very deep whenever, in the near future, my stay here came to an end and I either drowned myself or was sent to reform school. These few trifles would hardly matter, but all the same, I lived in constant view of such unpleasantness and suffered from it. On that spring day in the park, I met a young lady who attracted me very much. She was tall and slender, elegantly dressed, and had an intelligent, boyish face. I liked her at once. She was of the type that I loved, and she began to occupy my daydreams. She was probably scarcely older than I was, but much more mature, elegant, and with clear contours, almost already a total lady, but with a hint of high spirits and boyishness in her face that I especially liked. I had never succeeded in approaching a girl I felt attracted to, and I didn't succeed in her case either. But the impression she made was stronger than any prior occasion, and the influence this in- infatuation had on my life was powerful. Suddenly, I once more had an image before me, a lofty, revered image, and oh, there was no need, no urge within me as strong, as vehement as my wish to respect and venerate something. I gave her the name Beatrice because, without having read Chante, I knew about her from an English painting, a reproduction of which I had kept. It was an English pre-Raphaelitic painting of a girl, slender with very long limbs and a long narrow face and spiritual hands and features. My beautiful young girl didn't resemble her exactly, though she too displayed that slenderness and boyishness of forms that I love, and something of that spirituality and soulfulness in the face. I never said a single word to Beatrice, and yet she exerted the strongest influence on me in those days. She held up her image before me, she opened a shrine for me, she made me a worshipper in a temple. From one day to the next, I began to stay away from tavern going and roaming the streets at night in a gang. I was able to be alone again. I once more enjoyed reading and talking walks. This sudden conversion made me the butt of plenty of jokes. But now I had something to love and adore. I once again had an ideal life. Life was once again filled with presentiments and a mysterious, variegated twilight glow. And that made me insensitive to scorn. Once more I felt at home with myself, although only as a slave and servant of a venerated image. I can't think back to that time without some tender emotion. I was trying again with the most ardent efforts to construct a bright world for myself from the ruins of a period in my life that had collapsed. Again, I was living altogether in the one and only desire to cast away what was dark and evil in me and to dwell entirely in the light, kneeling before gods. Anyway, this present bright world was to some extent my own creation. It no longer meant taking refuge and crawling back to my mother and a sheltered life devoid of responsibility, but a new sincere service that I had myself invented and demanded with responsibility and self discipline, my from which I suffered and was always trying to escape, was now to be transfigured into spirit and worship in this sacred fire. There must no longer be any darkness, any ugliness, any nights spent in mourning, any palpitations of the heart when looking at dirty pictures, any listening at forbidden chores, any lust. In place of all that, I set up my altar with the picture of Beatrice, and as I consecrated myself to her, I consecrated myself to spirit and the gods. The portion of my life that I snatched away from the forces of darkness, I sacrificed to the forces of light. My goal was not pleasure but purity, not happiness but beauty and intellectuality. This cult of Beatrice altered my life entirely. Only yesterday, a precocious cynic, I was now a temple servant whose goal was to become a saint. I not only cast off the evil's way I had become accustomed to, I tried to change everything. I tried to bring purity, nobility, and dignity into everything, keeping this in mind in the way I ate, drank, spoke, and dressed. I started off the day with cold salutations, which at first I had to force myself strenuously to perform. My behavior was serious and dignified. I bore myself erect and walked at a slower and more dignified pace. It may have seemed funny to onlookers. In my mind, it was sheer divine service. Of all the new practices in which I sought expression for my new frame of mind, one became important to me. I began to paint. It started with my finding that the English picture of Beatrice I owned didn't sufficiently resemble the girl I used to see. I wanted to try and paint her for myself. With a brand new joy and hope I assembled in my room. I recently moved into a room of my own. Fine paper, paints, and brushes, and I prepared a palette, glass, porcelain dishes, and pencils. The fine tempera colors in little tubes that I had bought delighted me. Among them was a fiery chrome green that I still seemed to see as it first gleamed in the little white dish. I began cautiously. To paint a face was hard. I wanted to attempt something else first. I painted ornaments, flowers, and little imaginary landscape, a tree by a chapel, a Roman bridge with cypresses. At times I became completely absorbed in their playful activity. I was happy as a child with a box of paints, but finally I began to paint Beatrice. Some sheets were total failure and were thrown out. The harder I tried to picture to myself the face of the girl whom I met on the street from time to time, the less success I had. Finally, I gave up and simply starting a face following my imagination and the lead spontaneously furnished by my first strokes, by the paint and the brush. It was a dream face that resulted, and I was not unsatisfied with it, but I continued the experiment at once, and each new sheet spoke a little more distinctly, coming closer to the type, although not at all to the reality. I grew more and more accustomed to draw lines and fill in surfaces with a dreamy brush. Those lines and surfaces had no model but were produced by playful groping from my unconsciousness. Finally, one day, almost unconsciously, I completed a face that spoke to me more urgently than the earlier ones I had. It was the face of that girl. For some time, that hadn't been my intention. It was something different, something unreal, but no less valuable. It looked more like a young man's face than a girl's. The hair wasn't like blonde like my pretty girl's, but brown with a reddish tinge. The chin was strong and firm, but the mouth like a red flower. The whole thing was a little stiff and mask like, but impressive and full of secret life. When I sat down in front of the finished picture, it made a strange impression on me. It seemed to me like a sort of divine image or sacred mask, half male, half female, ageless, equally strong willed and dreamy, rigid yet secretively alive. That face had something to say to me. It belonged to me. It made demands on me, and it resembled somebody I didn't know whom. From some time after that, the portrait accompanied all my thoughts and shared my life. I kept it hidden in a drawer. I didn't want anyone to lay hands on it and use it to mock me, but as soon as I was alone in my room, I pulled out the picture and it kept me company. In the evening, I would pin it to the wallpaper over my bed facing me. I would look at it till I fell asleep, as it was the first thing I saw in the morning. In that same period, I started to have lots of dream again, just as I had always had in my childhood. It seemed as if I hadn't dreamed for years. Now the dreams returned, an entirely new set of images. Very often, the portrait I had painted showed up in them, living and speaking, friendly or hostile to me, sometimes twisted with a grimace, and sometimes infinitely beautiful, harmonious, and noble. And one morning, as I awoke from such dreams, I suddenly recognized it. It looked at me as a face so enormously well known. It seemed to be calling my name. It seemed to know me as a mother does. It seemed as it had been interested in my doings for all eternity. My heart pounding, I stared at the sheets, at the thick brown hair, the half feminine mouth, the strong forehead that was peculiarly bright and had dried that way on its own. I I felt recognition, discovery, knowledge growing nearer and nearer in me. I jumped out of bed, stood in front of the face, and it looked at it from as close as possible, right into the wide open greenish faced eyes, of which the right was somewhat higher than the left, and all at once the right eye twitched. A light and subtle twitch, but a distinct one, and as it twitched, I recognized the picture. Why had it taken me so long to discover it? It was Demian's face. Later, I often compared the picture with Demian's actual features, and I found them in my memory. They weren't the same, but similar. Yes, it was Demian. On one evening in early summer, the sun was sending oblique red rays through my window, which faced west. Twilight gathered in the room. Then I hit on the notion of pinning the portrait of Beatrice or Demian to the cross formed by the window frame, and to look at it as the evening sun shone through it. The face was blurry, without contours, but the red rimmed eyes, the brightness on the forehead, and the violently red mouth glowed strongly and wildly from the surface. I sat facing it for some time, even after it had grown dark, and gradually I got the feeling that it wasn't Beatrice or Jimian, but myself. The picture didn't resemble me, nor was it meant to, I thought, but it depicted that which constituted my life. It was my inner self, my face, fate, or my demon. That's how my friend would look if I ever found one again. That's how my beloved would look if I ever won her. That's how my life and that would be. This was the sound and rhythm of my faith. In those weeks, I had begun reading a book that made a stronger impression on me than anything I had yet read. Even later on, I seldom had such an experience with books, except perhaps with Nietzsche. It was a volume of novels with letters and aphorisms, many of which I didn't understand, though they all had a marvelous, spellbinding attraction for me. Now, one of the sayings occurred to me. I wrote it in ink under the portrait. A man's faith and his character are two names for the same concept. Now I had understood it. I still often ran across the girl I called Beatrice. I no longer felt any agitation when I did, but always a gentle harmony of minds, an emotional presentiment. You are linked to me, but not you yourself, only your picture. You are a portion of my faith. My longing for Max Chemian grew strong again. I knew nothing of his doings and hadn't for years. Only once I had met him during vacation. I now see that I have omitted this brief meeting in these memories, and I see that I did so out of shame and vanity. I must make up for it and relate it now. Well, then, once during vacation, bearing the blaze and constantly somewhat world wearily expression I affected during my drinking days, I was sauntering through my hometown, swinging my walking stick and looking at the same old, unchanged, despised faces of the Philistine burghers when I ran across my former friend. As soon as I saw him, I cringed, and quick as a flash, I was forced to recall Franz Cromer. If only Demian had really forgotten their story. It was so unpleasant to be under that obligation to him. It was actually just a stupid story of children's doing, but nevertheless, it was an obligation. He seemed to wait and see whether I would greet him, and when I did so as casually as possible, he gave me his hand. That was his handshake again, so firm and warm, yet unemotional and manly. He looked attentively at my face and said, "You have grown tall, Sinclair." He himself looked quite unchanged, just as old and just as young as always. He joined me. We took a walk and spoke about unimportant things only, nothing about the old days. I recalled that at one time I had written to him one more than once without receiving a reply. Oh, if only he had forgotten that as well. Those stupid, stupid letters. He didn't mention them. When this occurred, there was still no Beatrice and no portrait. I was still in the midst of my dissolute period. At the edge of town, I invited him to go to a tavern with me. He went along. Boastfully, I ordered a bottle of wine, poured, clinked glasses with him, and showed that I was quite familiar with students' drinking customs. In fact, I drained the first glass in one draught. "Do you go to the tavern a lot?" he asked me. "Oh, yes," I said lazily. "What else is one to do? When you come down to it, it's still the most entertaining thing." "You think so?" "Maybe it is. Anyway, something about it is very fine intoxication, the basic aspect of it. But I find that for most people who spend lots of time in tavern, that's altogether lost. It seems to me as if frequenting taverns especially is somewhat truly Philistine. Yes, for one night with burning torches, one working up to a real beautiful Frenchy and delirium. But to go on in the same way, one glass after another, that can't be true, can it? For instance, can you picture Foss sitting night after night at the table reserved for regulars? I dragged and I drank and looked at him hostilely. "Yes, but not everyone happens to be Faust," I said curtly. He looked at me somewhat puzzled. Then he laughed with his old vigor and superiority. "Well, why argue about it? At any rate, the life of a drunkard or libertine is presumably livelier than those of the faultless citizens." And then I read it once. "The life of a libertine is one of the best preparations for becoming a mystic. It's always people like Saint Augustine who become seers. Earlier in life, he was true an epicure and a playboy. I was suspicious and didn't want him to lord it over me, so I said in my blaze manner, 'Yes, everyone to his own taste. To be perfectly honest, I am totally unconcerned with becoming a seer or anything like that.' Chimian's knowing eyes, slightly narrowed, flashed at me. "My dear Sinclair," he said slowly, "it wasn't my intention to say anything unpleasant to you. Beside the purpose for which you are now drinking your glasses of wine, neither I nor you know. The thing in that constitutes your life already knows why. It's so good to know this, that inside us there's a self that knows everything, wills everything, does everything better than we do ourselves. But excuse me, I must get home." Our leave taking was brief. I kept sitting there, very much out of sorts, finished my water bottle, and discovered when about to leave that Demian had already paid for it. That annoyed me even more. My thoughts were once more centered on that minor incident. They were filled with Demian, and the words he had spoken in that suburban taverns resurfaced in my memory, oddly fresh and unforgotten. It's so good to know that inside us there's a self that knows everything. I looked at the picture hanging in the window and now completely dark, but I saw the still gleaming eyes. That was Demian's gaze, or else it was the self inside me, the one that knows everything. How I missed Demian. I didn't know a thing about him. He was inaccessible to me. I only knew that presumably he was a student at some university and that after he finished secondary school, his mother had moved away from our town. Going all the way back to my relations with Cromer, I searched out every recollection of Maximian. How many things that he had once said to me I now heard once again, and everything was still meaningful, timely, and of concern to me. Even what he said at a very last, very unpleasant meeting, our libertines and saints, was suddenly clearly present in my soul. Hadn't things gone with me in precisely that way? Hadn't I lived in drunkenness and darkness, numb and lost, until with a new impulse in life that exact opposite had come to life within me? The longing for purity, the yearning for sanctity. Thus I continued to pursue my memories. Night had fallen some time back, and outside it was raining. In my memories too, I heard it raining. It was the time under the chestnut trees where he had once questioned me about Franz Cromer, and I had guessed my first secrets. One thing after another came to mind: conversations on the way to school, confirmation lessons, and finally, I recalled my very first meeting with Maximian. Now, what had it been about? I didn't hit it on the right away, but I gave myself time. I was completely absorbed in the subject, and now I recalled it that also. We had been standing in front of my house. After he had let me know his opinion about Cain, then he had spoken about the old, obliterated coat of arms located about above our entryway on that keystone with God brother from bottom to top. He had said he was interested in it and that people should pay attention to such things. That night I dreamt about Jimian and the coat of arms. It kept changing shape. Jimian was holding it in his hands and it was small and grey, often terrifically big and multicolored, but he explained to me that it was nevertheless one and the same. But finally he persuaded me to eat the coat of arms. After I gulped it down, I felt with horrible fright that the bird in coat of arms I had swallowed was alive inside me, was filling all the way to escape there, and was beginning to consume me from within. Filled with deadly fear, I woke up with a start. My mind cleared. It was the middle of the night, and I heard the rain coming into the room. I got up to shut the window, and as I did so, I stepped on a bright object that was lying on the floor. It was the morning I discovered that it was the picture that I had painted. It was lying on the bed floor and curled up. I spread it out between two sheets of blotting paper and pressed it inside a heavy book to dry. When I came to look at it the following day, it was dried, but it had changed. The red mouth had become paler and little narrower. Now it was altogether Damien's mouth. I now set about painting a new picture, the bird in the coat of arms. I no longer clearly remembered what it exactly looked like, and as I knew, some of its detail couldn't be made out even close up because it was old and had frequently been painted over. The bird was standing or sitting on something, perhaps on a flower or on a basket or nest or on a tree top. I didn't worry about that, but began with the elements I had a clear idea of. Out of some obscure necessity, I began at once with strong colors, The bird's head in my picture was golden yellow. As the mood took me, I continued working on it and finished it in a few days. Now it was a bird of prey with the sharp, bold head of a sparrowhawk. The lower part of its body was enclosed in a dark terrestrial globe from which it was working itself free, as if from a gigantic egg. The background was sky blue. As I studied the picture longer, it seemed more and more to me as if it was the brightly colored coat of arms that had appeared in my dream. I wouldn't have been able to write a letter to Demian even if I had known where to send it. But with the same dreamlike presentiment that was guiding all my actions at the time, I decided to send him the picture of the sparrowhawk, whether it reached him or not. I wrote no message on it, not even my name. I trimmed the edges carefully about a large envelope and wrote my friend's formal address on it. Then I mailed it. An exam was approaching, and I had to spend more time on schoolwork than usual. I had been back in the teacher's good graces ever since I suddenly changed my disgraceful ways. Even now, I probably wasn't a good student, but neither I nor anyone else still thought about the fact that 6 months earlier, my punitive expulsion from school had been expected by everyone. My father was writing to me more in his formal tone again, without reproaches or threats, but I felt no urge to explain to him or anyone else in what way the change in me had taken place. It was only an accident that this change coincided with the wishes of my parents and teachers. This change didn't bring me closer to others or make me intimate with anyone. It only made me lonelier. It was directed at same goals at Demian and a far off destiny. I myself didn't know what it was, for I was in the midst of it. I had begun with Beatrice, but for some time I had been living with my paintings and thoughts of Demian such a totally unreal world that even she vanished completely from my sights and thoughts. I couldn't have said a word to anyone about my dreams, my expectations, my inner transformation, even if I had wanted to. But how could I have wanted to?